2002 was a significant year for the cinematic zombie, insofar as it saw the release of Resident Evil, based on the video game series, which was itself heavily inspired by George Romero's zombie films, and the arguably more groundbreaking 28 Days Later. These two films undoubtedly rejuvenated the on-screen zombie, given its relative lack of screen time in the 1990s, compared to the number of films that followed 2002. For instance, 2004 saw the release of two films deeply indebted to Romero. Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead both nominally and contextually paid homage to Romero's zombie mythos, while Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead was an official remake of Romero's 1978 film, albeit one that differed significantly in as much as its fast-running and adrenalized zombies had far more in common with 28 Days Later's Infected than it did with Romero's shambling undead. Romero himself participated in this renewed examination of the zombie film with the release of 2005's Land of the Dead, in which he explored just how degraded his cinematic world had become and how the zombies that populated it had begun to demonstrate facets of cognition. The zombie film then was revivified to an extent that ensured its survival into the foreseeable future. Whilst 28 Days Later's narrative offered an optimistic closure for its protagonists, the film's artistic and commercial success ensured it was inevitable that a sequel would be considered. Danny Boyle was committed to direct another project, although he was executive producer for the sequel, and instead offered the role to Juan Carlos Fresnadillo. This change in directorial vision accounts for the rather marked tonal shift within 28 weeks later. Where Boyle's film was, at least in its initial London scenes, oniric and languid, Fresnadillo's film is an entirely faster affair, more driven by action sequences than panoramic explorations of the post-viral landscape. Yet the two films share many spatial concerns: the symbiotic relationship between space and identity, an apparent opening up of spatial freedom tempered by the viral threat, and the urban landscape as a space that has lost meaning through a lack of cognitive investment. As its title suggests, the majority of the film takes place 28 weeks after the initial outbreak of the rage virus, and the narrative centres on the attempt by NATO forces, led by the US Army, to repatriate Britain, and particularly the formation of a safety zone within London's Isle of Dogs district. However, the film's opening sequences take place during the initial outbreak and place them in around the same timeframe as the events of 28 Days Later. Don and Alice, a married couple, are sheltering in a farmhouse alongside the elderly couple whose home it is, Jeff and Sally, a young man, Jacob, and a young woman, Karen, whose boyfriend has apparently left the house 5 days ago and hasn't returned. As is the case with 28 Days Later, uninfected survivors seek shelter in order to essentially hide from the groups of infected people who roam the landscape, looking for the signs of life that indicate the presence of uninfected people. The act of utilising a space purely for the purposes of shelter means that, to all intents and purposes, this status is the only signification that such a space might be granted. Edward Ralph suggests that this sort of spatial engagement can be described as behavioural insideness or physical presence in a place. The term denotes an engagement with space that's fleeting and based purely on that space being one in which particular behaviours are pursued, behaviours that are significantly, relatively unimportant facets of the individual's spatial identity. Essentially, the body is present, but none of the individual's identity is invested into the space. Ralph's term finds its most clear context within urban spaces and the ways in which people come into contact with particular spaces as a result of their behavioural patterns. So people spend time within train stations and supermarkets because the behaviours they exhibit, such as the need to travel or buy groceries, requires that they do so. Unless the individual works in one of these spaces, then any engagement is transient and unlikely to require any significant cognitive investment. Whilst the assembled survivors are primarily gathered within the farmhouse for the purpose of sheltering from the infected, there are additional aspects of spatial engagement and interpersonal relationships that ensure their behaviour can't simply be described in terms of behavioural insideness. The farmhouse is, for Don, Alice, Jacob and Karen, a space that Ralph might describe in terms of emphatic insideness. Within such spaces, the individual must demonstrate a willingness to be open to significances of a place, to feel it, to know and respect its symbols. The farmhouse is not simply a refuge, it's a space in which the gathered survivors reaffirm each other's humanity and reiterate aspects of culture that might otherwise be jettisoned in cases where people are bereft of the company of others. This group also recognised the fact that despite the profound upheaval that's occurred, this space is still Jeff and Sally's home, and any engagement they have with the place always acknowledges this fact. The use of the term place here rather than space denotes the signification present within the home. As Tim Cresswell states, place at a basic level is space invested with meaning in the context of power. The significant cultural investment that's present within the farmhouse as a locus of group identity is demonstrated in the opening scene in which a dinner is prepared for the gathered survivors. Within 28 days later, when Jim is rescued from a group of the infected by Mark and Selena, he's taken to their shelter, a newsagent kiosk within the London Underground. The Underground is itself a clear example of a space in which behavioural insideness is practiced. People utilise the space for the sole purpose of travel. And Mark and Selena's shelter is similarly a space in which the singular activity of sheltering occurs. Once there, Mark throws a box of Maltesers at Jim's feet and tells him to eat, an action that suggests that the act of eating is nothing more than a perfunctory necessity. The dinner at the farmhouse, conversely, is an act of cultural reification. Rather than simply eating foraged items of confectionery seated on the floor of a cubbyhole, the group of survivors partake in what is essentially a ritualized act that, in the circumstances, actually possesses a somewhat rebellious quality, insofar as it carries a refusal to completely disregard pre-catastrophe cultural practices and momentarily allows the company of other people to be more important than the constant acknowledgement of the events occurring outside in the wider world. Peter Hutchings suggests that within the abandoned landscape, emptied as it is of the potential for individual and social agency, there is the possibility of subjects regressing to something less than human, and the maintaining of the ritualized group dinner ensures some element of humanity is retained. Don and Alice joke about the fact that their pantry is limited, whilst Jeff offers some tasting notes with regards to a bottle of wine that Don has procured. The normality of the dinner is surreal given the severity of the situation that the group are sheltering from. Smelling a glass of wine in order to detect its characteristics seems, in these circumstances, incredibly luxurious. However, the effect of this act and the maintaining of the ritual of sitting down to dinner allows a momentary element of escapism to be enjoyed. Ralph argues that home is the foundation of our identity as individuals and as members of a community. It is not just the house you happen to live in. It is not something that can be anywhere, that can be exchanged, but an irreplaceable centre of significance. It's entirely understandable then that Jeff and Sally have remained in their own home rather than attempt to find other survivors. Whilst we're not offered any information regarding the circumstances in which the rest of the group came to take shelter within the farmhouse, it's likely that they happened upon Jeff and Sally rather than the opposite, given the fact that Jeff and Sally are an elderly couple and implicitly less physically mobile than the younger members of the group. This home offers far more than shelter. It's the centre of their identity as a married couple and retains profound emotional significance. For example, there are family photos within the home that reiterate the couple's status as grandparents, regardless of whether their grandchildren have succumbed to the virus. Indeed, their age and their acute attachment to this home in particular allows them to be viewed in familial terms with regards to the gathered group of survivors. Jeff and Sally can be viewed as grandparental figures, whilst Don and Alice, being parents of 2 children, can be regarded as parental figures. Jacob and Karen, being younger still, can be considered to be the children of the group. This dynamic is exemplified in a scene where the meal is served. Karen places her own plate to one side, saying that Sam, her boyfriend, will be hungry when he returns. Jacob rebukes her statement, suggesting that Sam's absence indicates he is either dead or infected, causing Karen to argue with him. Don scolds Benjamin, and the scene momentarily becomes a family drama. This home then is a centre of significance for the other members of the group and is a familial space by extension. Edward Krupa argues that the single most important factor in the development of a unified sense of community is the family, and he states that urban people continue to rely strongly on members of the immediate family, although extended family ties seem to be weakened in the city, largely because of spatial separation and the existence of alternative kinds of bonding material. It's significant that the farmhouse is on the outskirts of London, where, according to Krupa, there's a stronger compression of signification with regards to relationships. The farmhouse embodies both traditional aesthetics and modes of living, and it is therefore an appropriate space for this adoptive extended family to develop. It's tempting to assume that the static family unit that is cognitively attached to the space of the home is one that enjoys relative safety. However, as Don and Alice's conversation in the kitchen demonstrates, their food supplies are most definitely finite. Don bemoans the fact that they're down to their last tin of tomatoes, yet have 5 tins of chickpeas. Darren Reed and Ruth Penfold Mounts suggest that within zombie narratives, mobility is key to survival, not only insofar as humans need to move more quickly than zombies, but also in the sense that survivors must be willing to abandon former homes and be willing to either continually survive on the road or else be willing to abandon a temporary camp once it becomes compromised. Within such circumstances, the cognitive signification of the home in terms of a particular physical location must become secondary to a willingness to become mobile in order to find food and other survivors and to escape any attacks from the infected. It's significant that Don and Alice's children, Tammy and Andy, escaped the initial outbreak of rage by virtue of the fact that they were in Spain on holiday with their school. This temporary fracture of the family unit is an event that allows the children to be shielded from the civil unrest that followed the virus's outbreak. Cresswell states that places are not always stationary, and this view can be demonstrated by the fact that Don and Alice, whilst having left the particular location of their home, have transposed elements of their family unit to the farmhouse. Whilst their own children are in Spain, Alice gazes at the photos of Jeff and Sally's grandchildren, allowing herself a reiteration of her own status as mother. And the presence of the younger Jacob and Karen allows Don and Alice to vicariously retain their parental roles. The family unit is a demonstrably transferable set of relations. Whilst most usually associated with the space of the home, it can exist outside of any particular space and even retain its values when the family is mobile. Indeed, Fresnadillo describes the family, Don and Alice's, as the heart of the film and suggests that the absence of Tammy and Andy evokes a profound emotion. This absence engenders a corresponding desire to express the parental relationship on Alice's part, and this yearning hinders her ability to distance herself from the farmhouse during a time of crisis. During the dinner scene, as Jacob and Karen argue over the fact that she believes her boyfriend will return, there's a frantic knocking on the door of the house, followed by cries for help. Alice recognises the voice as belonging to a boy, but Don urges caution in opening the door. Don eventually acquiesces and opens the door to this boy, who is immediately pulled into Alice's arms. The boy has, it transpires, fled from his parents, who were part of a larger group of the infected. The boy has led this group to the farmhouse, and moments after he's taken a place at the dinner table and voraciously partaken of the meal, the infected begin to enter the home. Dahlia Schweitzer suggests that fear of infection makes one especially aware of the distance between bodies, making a suspected carrier feel uncomfortably close. Metaphorical lines are drawn between those who are not infected and those who are deemed infectious or more likely to be infectious. When the boy first bangs on the door of the house, Karen shouts "Sam," believing her boyfriend has returned. Jeff, however, puts his hand over her mouth and urges her to be quiet. Similarly, once the boy starts to shout, asking to be let in, Alice rises from the table and moves towards the door before Don grabs her arm and says, "Wait, you don't know who's out there." Both Jeff and Don recognize the potential threat that this child poses, despite the fact that he demonstrates the power of speech, which is something that's immediately lost once an individual becomes infected. The boy's presence potentially places the group in danger. They can't definitively know that he's not infected, and nor can they discern whether the boy is alone, and therefore the action that's most beneficial to the group is to ignore his pleas and to maintain a distance between their healthy bodies and this body that has an unknown health status.